right.
Man, I gotta say, quite the year. I had the privilege, honor to meet you, and now you're a WNBF Pro. How does that feel, man?
It's pretty wild, to be honest. Yeah, it's still sinking in. Definitely competing as a pro at Worlds helped that sink in a little bit, but
Yeah,
yeah, just for context, of anyone who's not been aware of that, which why would you? Um, the goal of turning WNBF pro, I actually set way back in '06 when I attended my first INBF show, and I saw my first natural bodybuilding show, and there was a the guy who won the overall. He got his WNBF pro card, and I was thinking about competing, and I would compete the next year in my first season. So that was, 2006 was 17 years ago, believe it or not. So that, and I did my first INBF shows in '09. So this is 14 to 17 years and like the goal and then in the making. So yeah, it's a big deal to me, man. And the fact that I did not get completely stomped at Worlds was pretty cool. Like placing seventh means I beat a couple pros in the most competitive show in the most competitive class. So I was, yeah, just to kind of, I didn't think I'd ever get to this level. So to be here is pretty astonishing to parts of me.
man, it's pretty cool to watch, man. I've seen the worlds, well, at least through social media. The level of conditioning, the size, well, the apparent size of those guys, it's quite crazy, man. When I first knew about natural bodybuilding, I think it was because of you, man. So just typing WMBF Pro in the promo image that I did, I felt cool, man. I felt like he did it, man. He really did it.
Well, I really greatly appreciate that, dude. It's yeah, you honor me by calling it out. So I think I'm gonna just give away my doctorate now because I have a better title. So who needs it? You know?
Well, I could use a PhD and all those. They look pretty cool.
I get you. If I can figure out just how to feed it through the phone, I'll hand you this one right here. It's
That's pretty awesome, man. As always, thanks for taking the time. I really do appreciate these conversations that we're having. I think it's since 2020 that was the first one. Then we got to meet. To me, it's super insightful to hear about your research, other aspects of research that you review through mass and so on and so forth. So anyway, after all that emotion and post, maybe a little, I don't know if that's your case, the let's say post high blues. I don't know if you have any of that because it happens, man. When you achieve something as big as that, kind of hits, right?
yeah, and it's something that I've coached a lot of people through, and this is my fifth contest season, and it's something I've definitely experienced before. But it's also not even just limited to contest prep. I think it's exacerbated by contest prep because you're also being impacted by all of the physiological changes that go on from dieting and the psychological changes where you tend to get really really hyper focused, um, and you kind of get tunnel vision, so you tend to just live in like the future and not even the now, and the future stops at your last show of the season. So you're like, as you get closer and closer and closer to it, it's like the blinders on the horse. So as a coach, and so yeah, I experienced this when I finished my PhD. I had kind of like a what now syndrome. Um, I experience this to a limited degree after I do big powerlifting meets, even sometimes, or people sometimes experience this once the honeymoon phase is over in their relationship. They're like, oh, this is a big change. We're building this together, and couples sometimes struggle with that. So I think whether you're in business, in relationship, in competition, even coaching, I've experienced this, taking an athlete who then competes at Worlds and they hit it big, and then next thing you know, you're just kind of writing a normal training block for January. It's um, I think after like every peak, there's a cliff, and
Yeah.
knowing that is important. And I posted this on my threads, but I think there's like three keys to um, processing it and making sure that it's not something that is debilitating or becomes like depression or something that actually takes away from your goals. Is one, first, just recognize that it's normal to feel down after a high, because you have to come back to normal and everything is going to be relative to that. And to some degree, those emotions need to be felt, but you don't want to attach like a story to them, you know, like humans are animals that are relatively unique in that we suffer more than we need to because, if a cat breaks its leg, it's in pain, and then it walks around on three legs and it does what it needs to do and it heals. And the suffering is contained to the fact that my leg is broken and it's hindering me, but I'm going to work around it. If a bodybuilder breaks their leg, it's, oh my God, am I going to be able to squat? What does this mean? Is my life over? Do I need to get a new job? Will people, who am I now? I have the identity as a bodybuilder. So there's not only the suffering of breaking your leg, but there's this story attached to it. And in my experience, sometimes when we're feeling bad or we're feeling suffering, we want to know why because we're humans. So sometimes we attach meaning or we ruminate on it or we get obsessed with it. And sometimes we'll create a story as to what these feelings mean when they are just normal feelings to be had. So I think the first step is just to recognize post-achievement blues is a real thing. It's a normal thing. To some degree, they need to be felt, but you don't want them to spiral. And the way to prevent that is when you're still at the peak, when you're not in your blues, is plan your next goal, which sometimes is hard because you're focused on like, I'm competing on Saturday. But it's like, write your off-season plan. Think about what do you want to do this year? Take some of that. And it typically you don't crash like the hour after the show. So, on Sunday when you're ruminating, you can't sleep and you're so excited, plan out, what do I want to do this off season? What's next? Sometimes I'll think like previous seasons, I would think about, oh, I want to do a powerlifting meet or a strongman competition, or I want to go do masters weightlifting. And that can really help soften that kind of empty nest syndrome. And then the third key is related to understanding how those two first keys interrelate. Planning the next thing is not an avoidance tool. That's critical. You're not trying to not feel the come down and just go on to the next goal so that you don't have to feel bad. It is truly a process of focusing on the next thing, but also I think actually feeling the blues because they mean something, right? So you need to kind of look inward and go, all right, what did it mean to be at my peak? Why was I at a peak? How did I feel? What was it about it that brought me to this high level of emotional state? And then now, how do I feel being at a little bit of a low? Why is it that way? What does it mean? What can I learn about this? What stories do I have about myself? What does it mean for me to be as a person, a competitor, a husband, a father, a wife, a brother, a sister, whoever you are and wherever you are in your life? I think you have to have those three things really well integrated. But for me, I've had very, very, very minor post-contest blues compared to other seasons because it's a little easier when your season goes well, right? So for example, in 2019, I got really, really close to winning. I placed second in the two INBF shows I did that were big enough for a pro card, and I won the one INBF show I did that was not big enough for a pro card. So that was like, I'm right there, And the feedback I got the whole time was, you need to be bigger. So it was like, okay, well, I was really close, and like, what more can I do? So the season's kind of just ending, and I would have kept going until I had got my pro card and been like this season if I thought that was in the cards. And I did at the beginning, and then I thought, oh, damn. So then I kind of had a little more of a post contest blues, and I was like, all right, let me jump into these strongman competitions. And it was a great shift in perspective. And I still felt what I needed to feel, but to some degree, the blues hit a little harder. This time, I turned pro. I competed as a pro, and now, because I exceeded my expectations and even my goals, now I'm actually doubling down on that. So my next goals are, okay, well, how do I move from someone who places seventh at Worlds to maybe cracks the top five? And this is my first pro off season, so it's exciting. I have something to go into. So even though I had a bit of a come down, like, oh man, contest prep's over, I'm not trying to get leaner anymore. I need to get healthier. And, what does this look like? And I'm not traveling. And, it's like no one's around because everyone's on holiday in December. And, okay, like, all right, okay, back to mass, back to the pyramids, back to all this. It's a little weird, but I also have this goal ahead of me that's pretty close to the one I just finished, which has helped tremendously. So I would say it's been more of like a peak and then a valley rather than a peak and then a cliff like it normally is. And I think I'm already past it now, 2.5 weeks post show. So I feel great. And I've been really enjoying the beginning of my off season. So that was a long winded answer. You're probably like, bro, We're trying to talk science. Shut up
Not
with
at
this
all.
philosophy stuff.
Not at all, man. That's actually, I'm glad that we touched upon this topic because well, I don't know how to put it, but in the fitness, evidence-based fitness side of things, I usually talk about papers, results, methods, and so on and so
Hmm.
forth. But the human side of things, that what makes these people go to the gym, what makes me try to do things like this, Instagram live streams with people such as yourself. And actually, I posted a study the other day about purpose, that people with purpose is generally healthier. So you can see it in your
Yeah.
own path because one thing is competing, which is not necessarily healthy on itself. But what happens after? You lose purpose, that you became a pro. That's it. No more lifting, no more iron culture. So I think the human side of things, and also during all the contest prep, what happens with the family, what happens with friends,
Mm.
what happens with other sides of your life
Yeah.
as a whole, right? So, not at all, my man. I actually love this sort of topic. So, pleasure.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, my whole shtick, my purpose is to try to help this community that I feel I've benefited from being a part of so much. Bodybuilding has done so much for me. And I know bodybuilding for many people can also lead to very rough times emotionally. And so not every, and there's also some people who do it once, they have a negative experience, it spits them out the other side. So my whole purpose is to increase the probability that someone gets the same benefits or different benefits out of physique sport that I do, through helping them educate on the scientific side, maybe helping them understand through my experiences from a philosophical side, both as a coach and an athlete. So I'm happy to share it. For me, it's all the same. It feels a little self-indulgent because I've been talking about it so much, but so long as it's helping people, then my purpose is fulfilled.
That's so sweet to hear, man. Because bodybuilding can be cold water. For instance, you study that maybe the dream bulk is not really the answer
Mm,
for many people,
yeah,
and you need to be patient. My God, you need to be patient in natural bodybuilding. You need to have a purpose. You need to learn to navigate those risky waters. Let's put it that
yeah,
way. So at least for me, it's been that way. I've been learning a ton from bodybuilding, especially the natural side of things, because well, the enhanced side of things, perhaps to me wasn't that attractive. And at least in my perspective, man, the your purpose, it's been, let's say, brought to my purpose. So it's really nice to communicate on that side, on that level, man.
yeah,
Just
brother. Well,
ju- just
it's
like
it's
that.
it's it's good to connect with people who are like-minded and share similar philosophies and values. So no, it's a pleasure, man. I always appreciate you giving me the ability to hopefully share my experience with a broader non-English speaking audience, because I'm limited by my white boyness. So thank you.
Well, I'm not exactly. But let's not get into those topics, man, because those can get a little bit spiky.
Hey,
So
simply
anyway,
put, I don't speak Spanish, you do, and there's a lot of people in the world who speak Spanish. And if I can help reach them and help a broader community, then it is a privilege and an honor. So thank you.
but my man, I have to make an important declaration. You're a great dancer, man. Even if you're not Latino, I suck at dancing, man. I've seen you dance, and I go, damn, he knows his stuff, man.
You know what? And we all break stereotypes sometimes, don't we? So
Yeah, for sure, man. So let's dig into the study at hand. I know
let's
this
go.
one's been a long time in the making, right? I think, correct me if I'm wrong, 2019, and then because of COVID and so on and so forth, until 2023. And the first thing I find really interesting in the latest published research is that you guys have been doing the preprints in this case. So why is that? Because I think it's pretty cool that we get to see this before they get printed and before we get the peer review.
Yeah.
Because until then, it's like you had to wait, even more, right? So what's the rationale behind that?
Yeah, so preprints are a part of a broader movement in the scientific community called the open science movement. And the reason why they're important is because while peer review is a really critical aspect of ensuring that we have the highest quality data that gets out as possible, it is a very time intensive process. So just the simple process of getting a manuscript together into the format needed for a journal, submitting it to an editor, having the editor go out and find two academics who have the expertise and the knowledge and the time to actually peer review it for free, mind you. That process takes a lot of time, and sometimes the peer review is very hit and miss for that reason. And it delays the dissemination of scientific information, sometimes as long as 6 to 12 months, because that's how long that whole process can take. Not always. Sometimes with journals that really try to get a faster peer review process, that can be down to as little as 6 weeks. And then sometimes, because they try to keep the process so fast, peer review quality gets sacrificed. So there's kind of this rolling of the dice that occurs with peer review, but it always delays the dissemination of information to some degree. So one of the things you can do is upload your paper before peer review to a preprint server. And so long as everyone knows that what they're looking at is non-peer reviewed data, that's fine. And in fact, it actually gives you an opportunity to improve the peer review process. So this is the second benefit of a preprint. The first is earlier dissemination of data. The second is that the whole community who you're attempting to serve, at least if you're doing like applied research, can look at it. And even in theoretical fields like, physics or something like that, academics get earlier access to the data, and your colleagues at the very least can go, well, something's wrong here, or you made an error here, I don't understand what you're saying. And the preprint servers have a robust system of comments. So when I published when I put the preprint on Research Square for this study, Milo Wolf, for example, newly minted Dr. Milo Wolf, came in there and had some comments like, hey, what about X, Y, and Z? This is mislabeled, here's a typo. And there were some other comments as well. And I was like, awesome. And then I also got a lot of DMs, people just asking me questions. And then in our community, especially because we are serving not just other academics, there was like 6, 7 like people who made videos, YouTube, Instagram lives, all kinds of content related to the study. And I got to see how is my study being interpreted generally and misinterpreted generally, right?
Yeah.
So that gave us the opportunity to change the way our discussion was written and make changes. And Sports Medicine Open, because they link to Research Square, like it's built into their process, they expect the authors, when they go through peer review, to say, hey, thank you, peer reviewers, we've made these comments, we made these changes. Oh, and by the way, these other things came up in peer review, which we modified. So one thing that was actually quite critical was that I noticed we mislabeled our two groups, which sort of didn't matter, but the primary analysis we did was a continuous analysis of the whole group. We regressed body weight change to outcomes in 1RM, as well as muscle thickness and skin fold thickness changes. And that was because our groups were limited in recruitment because of COVID. So we didn't emphasize the group-based changes, but we still had them. And the moderate and the large surplus groups got mislabeled. And while they had very similar outcomes for most things, they weren't exactly the same, which is why we mislabeled them. But we picked that up because of the preprint process and me making some changes to a figure. And I went, hold on. Oh, shit. We didn't unblind this right. So for the final study, like we fixed that error, which wasn't caught by the peer reviewers. And we also had a much more robust discussion to where we could contextualize some of the findings, because people kind of took the study as bulking doesn't work, which I think is a far too unnuanced take. So anyway, to answer your question, that's why preprints exist. And so long as people actually come back to the final product, which I think is important, and don't just kind of remember the preprint, which is the only potential issue with preprints when there are changes based on the preprint, then I think they're just a really big net benefit to the scientific community.
Yeah, totally. And I love the concept of open science. That's speaking of purpose. One of the reasons why I try to do these sort of things to bring science to people and not label science as, some elite sort of thing, which is
Yes.
not at all. And this study in particular, I find it super, super interesting because it can be disruptive,
Mm.
when we typically think about amassing phase, before thinking about training, usually the rationale is we need to up your calories. And to actually put this into practice, into test with trained subjects, with all the minutia about that, I think it's really interesting the outcomes, and especially the difference that you found with the biceps that give us the whole minutia of discussion, right? So I wanted
Mm.
to, if you agree, can we begin by the difficulties of the methods during the COVID pandemic? Did it affect all the research process on itself?
Tremendously. Yeah. So the study design was that we needed to have weight stable participants who would learn how to track their calories, demonstrate that they knew how to perform a squat and a bench press to a similar standard, and also demonstrate in their basic pre 1RM screening that they met the strength standard, which was being able to squat 1.5 times your body weight, being able to bench 1 times your body weight for men, and then shifting that down by 0.25 for women, so 1.25 and 0.75. So that process, they had to come meet us at the AUT labs, display that they could squat to a decent depth. We went over their training logs, walked them through how to use nutrition, which is actually was done off site. So Steve Taylor, our RD, he was the primary research assistant who was helping with that. So he would meet with the participant, he would assign them to a maintenance phase. And the goal was to have them for at least 2 weeks have their average body weight not change within a 1%. And that took a while for some people. And then also for them to learn how to track their macronutrients, calories, and report in with him. So he's establishing rapport. He's basically teaching them how to be an online coaching client, like we might have with a spreadsheet and the whole 9 yards. Some people had a lot of experience with that, some didn't. And then after that, they would get randomized to either a large 15% surplus, a small 5% surplus, or a maintenance group. And only Steve and the participant knew that. It was single blinded so that those of us at AUT physically present, because Steve's in the States, training the participants didn't know what they were assigned, just to have a little extra control so we wouldn't have any potential for bias. And the participants were told not to inform us. So what this meant is we kind of had like a pool of participants in a stable who hadn't quite actually started the study. They're in the maintenance phase. And then we also had participants actively in the study, and that was constantly going. So when COVID hit, when we had people in the study, we could do the best we could to work around it, but we did lose a handful of participants from the labs getting closed. But when we had restrictions on the lab, but it wasn't fully closed, we could actually get them in there. And then we actually had, I called it Cyber Colby. So Colby Sousa, one of my PhD students, he was one of the the research assistants on the study, and he'd be there spotting, loading, tracking, pushing them to do failure on their accessory work, meeting them in the labs, testing them, etc. And we had some people who were post 1RM testing, but just being trained because they'd come in 3 times per week for 6 weeks between the 1 week of testing on either side. So it's an 8-week study. So long as we got them past the pre-test for 1RM and the post-test for 1RM and ultrasound and skin folds, then we had a little more latitude. So they would come to the labs on their own, and Colby would just be a laptop from his apartment on Skype or Zoom or whatever and being wheeled around. And we'd make sure that they were squatting and benching in a cage, and that we had a research assistant in a different room because we had to social distance if in case something happened, and there, the video there. So it was this wild kind of situation that was very unique to COVID, but we kept the study going, and we lost the fewest number of participants we could from that. But each time we had one of those lab closures, we couldn't start new people. And that was the problem. So that means we had to keep people in this maintenance phase for months sometimes, and a bunch of them would just drop out and say, hey, I could have started in December or January or March or April, but I can't start 3 months from now. So on paper, it only looks like we lost 6, 7 participants, but in reality, we lost probably twice that. So we ended up falling very short of our target N. And even in 2022, when effectively New Zealand was no longer having the lockdowns or the limitations in the lab, Omicron came late to New Zealand because we did such a good job of keeping it a country that once we opened the borders again, everyone started getting COVID. So while we couldn't run the study because of COVID lockdowns, and then we kept having people getting sick, both research assistants more often than the actual participants. And I'm not going to disclose people's medical status, but basically the entire team at different times got COVID. and couldn't come into the labs, so we couldn't recruit people. And then we had a few participants get sick as well. So 2022 was a struggle to get the study done, and we essentially just exhausted the funds. And we went, all right, what do we got, and is it enough to publish? And we ended up with 17, so 5 or 6 people in the 3 groups, when we were trying to get like 10 to 15 in each group.
Right. On itself, I think it's already hard enough to standardize the training on itself, the nutrition side of things, and then you put that on the whole equation. Man, it's pretty much a miracle that we have this literature available right now. So the one thing I think it's crucial to discuss about this study is the training on itself,
Mm.
because maybe it can differ a little bit from what, I don't know, you would write a program you would write for a client, you know. So what was the rationale for this particular training program on this study?
Yeah, there's a reason why 95% of training studies are, I would say probably 3/4 of them are 3 days per week. And then say another 15-20% are 2 days per week. And then the remaining percentage is split between anything more than 3 days per week or 1 day per week. And the reason why is that there's logistical feasibility of actually supervising people, and research assistants need to be paid. And so what we decided was, okay, we're going to have a 3 day per week, them visiting a lab, us training them, and we'll try to make the best program that we can have for quote unquote trained lifters, both for strength in the squat and bench, and also hypertrophy at the sites we're measuring. So we were measuring triceps, biceps, and quadriceps muscle thickness changes, and then bench and squat 1RM. So our program was designed for the research question. It wasn't designed to be the best hypertrophy program. And this would be more of a problem if we were doing like DEXA scans, trying to look at full lean body mass changes. But our principal outcomes were muscle thickness changes at those sites. So because we were squatting, because we were benching, and then because our program had shoulder press, lat pull down, and curls basically every day. So that's what each session looked like. Instead of lat pull down one day, it was rows. We had a setup that wasn't exactly a perfectly balanced hypertrophy program. There was no leg curls. There was no, rear delt work, for example. There was no posterior chain work for like the hamstrings or glutes. There's no like RDL. There's no calf raises. So it was basically a mostly balanced program, to the point where we wouldn't want people to not join the study, but also need to be logistically feasible for the time and the cost of having research assistants and people coming into the lab. So yeah, essentially they came in and followed a squat bench, squat bench, squat bench session on each day, submaximal training between like a 6 to a 9 RPE in like the 4 to 8 rep range. And then they would do three exercises, like I said, like a bicep, a shoulder, and a back exercise, 3 sets to failure on those every day for the 3 days they came in. And I think it's a good program. Literally everyone got stronger. Their 1RM increased, marginally. And the changes in hypertrophy were within like the margin of error for the quadriceps and the triceps, but there was an increase when you look at the whole group as a whole in the biceps by about 0.2, 0.3 millimeters for the muscle thickness, so, or centimeters for the muscle thickness. So the it worked for the muscle groups that got more training. And also, you also have to think about what's your expectation over 8 weeks in trained lifters.
Yeah, for real.
So yeah,
So
if I may, I would
yeah, go
say
ahead.
if I could do the whole study again, what I would probably do is have them come in 2 days per week, and then train on their own 2 days a week and have us observe them via video. That seems really obvious now in 2023, and more studies are doing that. But we got so used to doing that type of thing because of COVID that it just wasn't something that we thought to do when we designed this study in 2018 and started it in 2019. But for example, shout out to Max Coleman, the deload study that came out.
Yeah,
They had people come in 2 days a week and then train on their own 2 days a week. And now with a 4 day per week program where you're looking at something that's a lot more common, and we'd probably get a higher N, more people would be willing to join. A lot of people, they go, oh, I can only train 3 days a week. I don't love science that much that I want to give up the way I think is optimal for training for me. So in the future, if I was to run this back, we would do that. And it would also save costs, right? We'd only, I mean, you still have to pay a research assistant for being there on video, but I think we'd still save some costs. There wouldn't be the travel component. It wouldn't take as long. You wouldn't have to set up the lab. You just need to make sure that the participants had the ability to film and, you know, or at least film after the fact, maybe not live. So it's just reviewing footage from the gym. So I think crossing that bridge might be like kind of a win-win, especially with trained individuals.
Man, there's a lot of challenges in research that when we read papers, hear about papers, we don't often think about. One
Yeah.
big one that you already alluded to, it's failure. These people train to failure. But you know, the whole discussion, okay, but what was failure for them? How was that supervised? How was that standardized? So on and so forth. And that's on itself, that's quite the conversation. But
Mm-hmm.
anyway, in at least in theory, I wanted to ask you about your particular hypothesis coming to
Yeah.
this study. But at least in theory, let's say we have a higher calorie diet. Well, maybe that could allow us to train more to allow us to recover from more volume. Maybe it can allow us to have greater carbohydrate intake, whatever it may be. So before throwing questions, I can recall the study from Slater. I think it was 2019 with yours truly
Mm-hmm.
there. Asking the question, was the energy surplus really necessary to optimize muscle gain? And I think it's a really complex question, more than people often think about, because
Yeah.
it depends very much on the context of the individual, the training on itself, how you measure actually muscle growth, the length of the study, you know. So what I'm going with this is, what were your particular hypotheses? Did you think that people in the higher calorie diets would actually gain a little bit more from their training, or not so much?
Yeah. So our actual hypotheses were that the surplus groups would do better than the maintenance groups, but not better than one another. So a small versus a large surplus would produce similar outcomes in these trained lifters, which I think is a key element of our hypotheses. They're specific to the population we're studying. And I'm glad you mentioned Slater and colleagues, because Slater reached out to me and a bunch of others, and we wanted to write this paper. And we started writing it with an open mind of, is a surplus required to maximize hypertrophy? Not to produce it, but to maximize it. Because we already know that there's a ton of data showing you can even gain muscle in a calorie deficit, depending on
Yeah.
context, right? You know, you take untrained, overweight individuals who are sedentary and you put them into a resistance training program on a even a pretty hard, like large calorie deficit, and they're going to gain muscle while losing body fat. You do that with a well-trained person who's relatively lean, probably not, and you're hoping to mitigate losses in lean mass, right? And then everything in between. So the only thing that we were able to really confidently come to as a conclusion in that Slater paper is that a calorie deficit does seem to mitigate the benefits of a approach to bulking. And since that paper in 2018 when we wrote it, there's been a meta-regression that was published that looked at the effect of calorie deficits on strength and hypertrophy. And it found that once you're in like a 500 calorie deficit on average, and obviously all those other factors besides a deficit come into play, training age, body fat, time, it seems to reduce the gains you can get pretty substantially on average. So we know that there's a negative effect of being in a deficit that scales with the side of the deficit, right? Muscle protein synthesis is an energetic process, the actual process of building new muscle tissue. Muscle damage repair, which shows up as MPS, is an energy intensive process. It actually takes calories to resistance train. And even more so, when you are going into a surplus, there is positive metabolic adaptation. Meat goes up. So the reason why we made our hypothesis that way is because you don't really know where you're at when you're at quote unquote maintenance. You know your body weight isn't changing, but you're probably fluctuating in and out of a 1 to 200 calorie deficit and surplus on a day-to-day basis. And that may add up over time, those moments when you're in a slight deficit where it's impairing just a little bit of that process and it's slightly less than ideal. So we leveraged that. Like, hey, we think a deficit's a negative. Maintenance is kind of floating in and out of a deficit. So maybe the surplus groups would do better. However, when we look at prior research on trained individuals, like Garta and colleagues from 2013, we see that larger surpluses primarily serve to increase fat mass accrual, at least over the time periods that have been observed, rather than enhancing the rate of hypertrophy. So surplus, positive; deficit, negative; maintenance, probably somewhere in between. But there's really no evidence to suggest for trained individuals, well-trained individuals, who can only gain so fast, they're closer to their genetic ceiling, that they would be able to put on additional muscle mass with the same training program. That's what you compare experimentally in studies, just by eating more. And it comes back to something I've said for a long time, is that your nutrition is permissive to gains, right? If you have a really, really solid set of training program, that's what's creating the stimulus. And then you just want to create the environment like a farmer, right? Like you get good seeds, you get everything set up, right? But if you don't get any water or sunlight, it's not going to matter. And that's kind of the way you look at nutrition. But you can't get like extra sunlight or extra water after you meet a certain threshold. Like there's an appropriate amount, and beyond that, it can do more harm than good. And that's where the analogy would be, okay, you're maxed out your rate of muscle gain, and now you're just accruing additional body fat.
I think that's where it gets both interesting and complex, because if we go to the training side of things and think about progressive overload, well, that's pretty much an organic process. You really don't have to do progressive overload, just pay attention perhaps. And also that hypertrophy training on itself, I got it from you, by the way, it's not really, you can talk about specificity in the same terms as strength training. You know, hypertrophy, it's kind of more in the middle. It's kind of blurry. It's kind of
Mm-hmm.
wishy. And people, myself included, I actually operated the other way around. I thought, well, maybe if I eat more calories, if I gain more weight, I get stronger. But the training side of things perhaps wasn't correctly designed, correctly programmed. So I think we need to first think about training as, the signaling for growth. And then the next, well, two challenges I can think of. The first one, for most people, perhaps not in a laboratory setting, 5% surplus can be really margin of error when we log calories and whatnot. That's one. And the second one, again, not in the context of a lab, how to measure muscle growth when we don't have access
Yes.
to ultrasound and things like that. Well, we pretty much have the scale, the how our clothes fit, and that's when bigger surpluses can lead us to believe that we're gaining more muscle when in reality it might not, right?
Yep. Absolutely. Yeah. So finding something out in the lab, it can be very, very useful. But then how do you apply that to the real world is a challenge, you know? So to speak to your first point of, can you really operationally institute a small surplus versus a moderate surplus, 15%? I think a lot of people would consider that moderate, right? And we actually found out, at least in this population, on average, they kind of become the same thing. So one of the reasons why we were able to accidentally mislabel our groups was that the mean change in body mass in the small and the large surplus groups was the same in both groups.
Yeah.
Meaning that when we tried to give people a 5% surplus, some of them were able to follow it no problem. Some of them gained too quickly. Some of them gained too shortly. And with only 8 weeks and making adjustments about every 2 weeks to the nutrition based upon body weight change, there's a lag time, right? So in the large surplus group, some of these people, maybe they ramped up their NEAT. Maybe they were getting better at tracking more accurately over time, and they found out, oh, actually, I was eating fewer or lesser or more calories than I thought in both groups. So what ended up happening was a similar mean change in body mass in both groups, meaning roughly on average the same surplus across everyone who got assigned to the non-maintenance groups. So to mitigate both the problem of only having 5 or 6 people per group, and also to address the limitation of the two groups functionally being on the same average energy surplus, what we did was a continuous analysis. So we took everybody in the whole study, all 17, which now actually is a sufficient enough sample size for us to make some conclusions and share this data, which is why we published instead of just going, well, screw it, there's 25 grand in the toilet. Was we analyzed everybody continuously with a regression, which just means plotting the relationship between variables based upon body mass changes. And when you look at the data, we have people who are in a small surplus all the way up to a large surplus. There were people in the maintenance group who gained a little bit, people in the maintenance group who didn't gain a little bit, and there was people in the small surplus group who gained only a little bit or gained more than they should have, and also same thing in the large surplus group. So we have this variety of body mass changes, which is your surrogate for how big was your surplus, your functional surplus, right? So that's really cool. So instead of answering the question, what's better, a 5 or 15% surplus, now we can answer the question with statistical robustness. We can answer the question, what's better, gaining more weight quickly or less weight slowly over an 8-week period, which is actually the same question, but now we have the ability to answer it with this different statistical analysis that we decided post hoc. So that's where the regression comes in. Now we have people plotted all the way along it, and we can say, okay, what's the relationship between rate of weight gain and increases in muscle thickness, changes in 1RM, and changes in skin fold thickness? And now all of a sudden we actually saw some pretty clear findings where in the group-based analysis, I think we had some false positives. So we saw that the large surplus group actually increased their bench more than the moderate surplus group and the maintenance group. But when we regressed that based upon body weight, that went away. So I think that was a false positive, right? I mean, even though it kind of makes sense, when we did the full scale analysis of all 17 people, there wasn't a relationship between anything except bicep thickness and skin fold thickness change with body mass changes, which I think is a really important finding. And also the strength of those two evidences were quite different, like a 10-fold difference, which we can talk about in a second. But I'll let you ask more questions before I jump ahead.
Yeah, that's right. Like I told you, I find this study in particular disruptive to my own particular beliefs and stuff like that. But speaking of the results, why do you think there was this false positive on a first inspection? And secondly, why do you think the biceps responded differently? Do you think it has to do that maybe it was more indirect volume, and perhaps then we can circle back to training being the primary, let's say, mediator of the
Yep.
results?
Yeah, so the false positive really just comes down to what's called sampling variance, right? Now, the good news is that we use what's called a Bayesian analysis. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I don't think it's too useful, but it is helpful to understand that it's really important if you're doing group versus group comparisons to have sufficient sample strength. Most people sometimes think, okay, well, if they find significance, then it's good to go. But truly, when you're using what's called frequentist statistics, when you have p-values and you're reporting, was there a significant difference between groups, you're looking at two things: the size of the difference and then the variability in that change. Now, for those types of tests to be used, you have to reach a sufficient sample to have a normal distribution in terms of the magnitude of response and then therefore also the variability in that response. You need a typical bell curve distribution. Now, if you just think about this logically without even thinking about stats, if I choose 5 people, even at random, the likelihood that 1, 2, 3, or even 4 of them is going to respond very differently to the average is a lot higher than if I had 15 people, right? So it's quite possible that my average response are all high responders just by chance when I only have 5 people. And that's called sampling variance, meaning that if I was to repeat that sample and rerun the study, I would have a different outcome potentially. Now, we use what's called a Bayesian analysis, which looks at it differently, and it doesn't assume a certain sample is achieved, and it just kind of restricts the analysis to what you had, and your level of confidence decreases as you have a lower sample size. So, but even then, you can really only make that conclusion relative to the population you sampled. So what I think is essentially happening, why we saw greater bench press gains in the group that was in the larger surplus, is just sampling variance. It just happened to be that people who had more potential to gain more bench press strength or other variables unrelated to what we manipulated resulted in greater bench press strength. Because why wouldn't it happen on squats, right? I don't have a good reason for that. And it didn't actually have to do with the independent variable that we're manipulating, which is the surplus size, right? So that's the answer to the first one. The reason why then when we look at the whole group of 17, why the only pieces of evidence that we found of a difference was that more body weight gain was related to greater biceps thickness increase and more skin fold increase thickness. I think that's because there was the highest volume and the highest intensity in terms of proximity to failure was actually achieved for the biceps. So there was a total of 18 sets, half direct, half indirect, that were performed for the biceps. So for example, they were doing 9 sets of curls and then 6 sets of lat pull downs and 3 sets of rows per week. And if we look at the data on average, which is what matters because we're looking at 17 people, not individuals here, for what's an appropriate volume, it's between 10 to 20 sets. If we kind of take the data combined from Bas Val's 2021 meta-analysis, where 12 to 20 sets was similar to 20 plus, and also Schoenfeld's 2017 meta-analysis that showed that 10 plus sets produced the greatest hypertrophy on average. And they counted volume the same way. They counted indirect work and direct work added up. So we were in the quote unquote average recommended volume ranges of 10 to 20 sets. And also based upon the recent meta-regression by Robinson, where they said, hey, the closer you get to failure, the greater stimulus it has for hypertrophy, not necessarily strength. That was also the exercises where they were being pushed to volitional failure, and most of the time actually hitting failure because we do a pretty good job in our lab. So they're hitting, a 9 to 11 RPE on 18 sets, training 3 days per week, plenty of recovery, right? While eating in a surplus. It's not too surprising to me that that was the muscle group that grew on average across the group, while the quads and the triceps over 8 weeks, I mean, they might have eventually grown. We didn't see a change outside of the typical error for those two muscle thickness sites. But before people get too excited about that, I want to talk about what did that relationship look like? So some people might be familiar with stats, some not. But the way we can describe the relationship between two variables is typically with what's called a correlation score, an R score. And that goes from 0 to 1. And if things are inversely related, it goes from 0 to -1. So an example of this might be height and weight. So generally, taller people weigh more, right? And the strength of that correlation is what we would describe as moderately strong. It's typically like 0.7. Because that's not everything. With the obesity epidemic, with people from different ethnicities and different bone structures, you can get someone who weighs a lot who's relatively short. But if you wanted to bet money on who would weigh more, and all you knew about two people was one was 6 foot and one was 5'6", you would guess the 6 foot person weighed more on average. Yeah. So 0.7 is a decent correlation. That means it explains, if you square that value, if you multiply 0.7 by 0.7, it explains the amount of variance that is of those two variables that is related to one another. So that's 0.49. So it means roughly 50% of your body weight is related to or explained by or predicted by your height. Okay? So what we had was a 0.25 R score for bicep thickness and change in body weight. So when you square that, it's a pretty small number, Right. So yeah, it's only explaining, actually, so that might be the squared value. It's only explaining 25% of the variance in your bicep thickness changes is related to the amount of weight you gained, which means that 75%, the vast majority or the majority of why these people grew muscle was not related to the surplus they were in. Maybe the training program, maybe their genetics, maybe all the other factors that we know goes into muscle growth. And the other statistic that comes out of a correlation, when you use the typical statistics, frequentist statistics that I mentioned earlier, is the p-value. Was this significant? In Bayesian statistics, we have what's called a Bayes factor. Okay. Now, I know this is sounding complex, but it's actually quite simple. This is just a value. It can be 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way up to 300 if you want. And it is just simply the odds of this being a greater probability of occurring when you change one variable. So what do I mean by that? Our Bayes factor was 1.4, meaning that if we took two people out of that 17, out of a hat, and one of them gained more weight and one of them gained less weight, I would say, it's 1.4 times more likely that the person who gained more body weight also gained more bicep thickness. Right. That sounds good, but it's actually not that strong. In comparison, the skin fold thickness change, that's the sum of their 8 sites that we measured. This is our proxy for body fat. Its Bayes factor was 10.4. Or what was it, 14? It was 14.1. It was 10 times greater. I don't have it right in front of me. It's either 10 or 14, but it's a lot higher. and it explained 50% of the variance. So that means half of what variables predict whether you're going to gain more body fat is your surplus size, right? The other half is related to genetics, nutrient partitioning, the training program, et cetera, other things related to maybe your environment, how high is your body fat to start, et cetera. What's your body fat settling point? We could think of a billion things that explain the other half, but half of your fat gain being related to how big your surplus is or how much weight you gained, that's a lot. And the strength of that evidence was 10 times that of the biceps thickness. So far and away, we had much stronger evidence that actually met the classification for strong evidence that the principal outcome from gaining more weight is gaining more body fat. While we had what we described as very weak evidence, but still evidence nonetheless, and only explaining a quarter of the variance that gaining more body weight would predict an increase in biceps muscle thickness. And then there was no relationship, no evidence for 1RM squat, 1RM bench, triceps, or quadriceps muscle thickness.
And that's super interesting and fascinating because one, I think, incorrect way of viewing the data. It's let's say, okay, I really don't care. I want big biceps. Nothing else matters, So
Let's
bring it
go.
on. Bring the big surplus. Even then, like you mentioned, like you're so well explained, maybe it's really not. It's not how we think that. Okay, more calories, more gains. Even if it's more fat, well, perhaps it's more fat than anything else in between, and also strength gains. So that's on the scientific side of things. But what I wanted to ask you mostly to finish off is how can we translate all this new knowledge into our daily practice? Let's say somebody wants to gain muscle. I think that's where it can become from this complexity really simple, but not so much, not
Yeah.
overly simplified. Just simple, but not overly simplified. I wanted to ask you, you as a coach, maybe not as a researcher, how can you know that your athlete is actually gaining muscle at a correct rate, besides the, I think it's 0.25 to 0.5% gain weekly, I think, on a weekly basis?
Yeah.
What do you pay attention in training, perhaps, or besides the weight gain?
Yeah, great question. So how do we apply this? And then what does it look like when we actually sit down as a coach with an athlete? The first question is answered by, this is not the only study on this topic. And we have to remember that just because something happened in a study doesn't mean we put blinders on and we say this is the ultimate truth. Like I mentioned with sampling variance, I mentioned earlier meta-regression and meta-analysis. We only move forward with the whole context of all the data published and all these things connecting and filling in the gaps that other studies haven't filled. So importantly, I mentioned Garta 2013, who found similar findings to us in trained individuals. But at the same time, those trained individuals were actually a mix of different Olympic athletes. They weren't, some of them were track and field athletes and probably just as well, if not more trained from a resistance training perspective as the participants we had. But some were like handball athletes. So they're trained, but not really. They lift weights sometimes for their sport. But that's not the only study either. So while those two studies agree, when we look at studies on different populations, we find something quite different. So for example, Rozenek and colleagues, and this study is awesome. What they did was they took untrained young males, and they put them on an 8-week bulking program. 1/3 of them, they had just eat their habitual diet. The other 2/3, they split between having two different weight gainers, one consisting entirely of carbs, or one that was a quarter carbs, quarter carbs, and then 3/4, so a quarter protein and 3/4 carbs, but 2,000 calories. So every day on top of their habitual diet, they're taking 2,000 calorie weight gainer. One group, it's just all carbs, right? It's just maltodextrin, bro, let's go. And the other
That's the
group,
dream, man.
yeah. And the other group's getting an additional 100 grams of protein and about 300 grams of carbs, right?
Yeah.
So that is a massive bulk, right? And what we see is that they gain an unsurprising amount of body mass over this period. They're gaining a little over 3 kilograms in 8 weeks. That's almost a pound a week. That's like 7 pounds, right? So big surplus, big weight gain. All that makes sense. But here's what's crazy. That was almost, on average, almost entirely consisted of lean body mass. So an untrained individual, if you tell them bulking doesn't work, go look at Helms' study and Garta's study. That's not the correct interpretation. When you have this very, very low threshold for the stimulus needed to max out your rate of muscle gains, it doesn't even matter if you're just taking in all carbs, right? You
Yeah.
know, Their baseline protein intake was around 1.5 grams per kg. It was sufficient, just this huge surplus. They could be drinking Diet Coke all day and running this weight gaining program. And young males over 8 weeks are going to put on almost exclusively lean body mass on average. So I think that's what's so important, is to remember the context. The people who've maybe because of Instagram have always held back and have never really had their newbie gains, and someone finally tells them, look, dude, you just need to eat. And they have this awesome experience, but they've been training for 3 years and now they make gains. They're going to hate my study. They're going to feel like it's fake news, because the thing they needed to actually get the big progress was finally allowing themselves to eat. And they had this experience. But as a coach, I can tell you that you don't get to go back to that well more than a couple times. There's the first time, your newbie gains that everybody gets, unless you have a really shit genetic hand. It doesn't really matter what program you're on. So long as you're eating in a calorie surplus, you're going to put on that first chunk of muscle that we all love and we get. And then we kind of honeymoon phase, look back at it. We're like, oh, that program must have been magic, or my diet must have been magic. Nah. As long as you were doing decent enough training with progressive overload, and so long as you were eating in a surplus, that probably would have happened and maxed out no matter what. We see here it could be straight carbs and a 3-day per week bulking program that a researcher wrote, cookie cutter for everybody. It still works, right? The next time, in my experience as a coach, that someone has the opportunity to get maybe a third or a half as good gains in terms of a bulking plan, it's got to be customized. You have to look at what doesn't work, why did you stop, what seems to be effective, and you create a customized hypertrophy plan for that person. And then you don't put them in as large of a surplus, because now they've made, probably 75% of their lifetime gains. They don't have all of that quick, easy stuff to gain again. You really got to create a stimulus. So now you're looking at maybe putting them on a 24-week slow bulk, and now they're training harder or better or more appropriate, or whatever happens to be your best guess at what's appropriate for them. And that's what comes into your second question, is how do you know as a coach? And essentially what you're doing is you're looking at a gestalt combination of multiple factors, right? You are creating an individualized program based upon the clues and hints of things you observed. And you're looking at a combination of factors such as performance, not 1RM performance necessarily, but are you able to improve reps or load at a given repetition range? Or is RPE going down? Are you able to progress most movements, especially isolation movements and ones that don't have huge skill components, because those are indicative that something's happening, like a machine leg extension? I mean, you're only going to get so good at that. So if you're getting better at that, some type of physiological adaptation is probably occurring. It might be better buffering. It might not be directly related to hypertrophy, but if you keep doing that, more overload is occurring, and it should eventually result in some hypertrophy. So that's the first thing, is you check, is overload occurring? Which it goes back to your point earlier. You don't try to force progressive overload. The second thing is, all right, are we slowly gaining weight? And as I said, it's kind of hard to do that. So maybe don't try a 5% surplus, maybe something like a 10%, as most people on average can't track that, as we saw with the same weight gain change in both groups in our study. And then finally, visually, are we seeing some positive things happen over a reasonable time course for your experience level? If you're an intermediate, yeah, you can probably look at that on a 3-month basis. If you're super advanced, you might need to look at it 6 to 8 months later after you do a mini cut. And then you have to reassess from there. But so long as the performance piece is occurring and the slow weight gain is occurring and you're correcting after the fact, and I think also some other subjective measures that sometimes I've maybe not given enough credence to, which I do think are important, like, are you getting a good pump? Are you getting a little bit sore in some of the main muscle groups, some of the stuff that RP focuses on? I think so long as you understand those are surrogate measures and they're lower on the list than primarily it is actual assessment over time, that's probably the best you can do. So the mistakes you don't want to make are getting your body composition tested regularly via methods that have poor reliability for at least individuals, getting too fixated on certain circumference changes. So for example, some people just look at the measurement change in their arms. If you gain body fat, your arms are going to go up. Maybe you could look at, is my arm and leg measurement going up at a greater rate than my waist circumference going up and my hip circumference going up, for women especially? I think that's decent. You should expect some gain in your waist and your hips over time when you're in a surplus, because it's almost impossible to gain pure muscle, except for like that Rosnick thing. It's your first 8 weeks of training ever. But yeah, if performance is going up, visually you think you're improving a little bit over an appropriate time scale. Again, it's not weekly like cutting. It's like few months, like mesocycle length for intermediates, and then quarterly at the earliest for advanced people, and sometimes needing to actually do a bit of a cut to trim back the fat to see underneath whether or not you improved. That's the best kind of combination you can have. If you really do want to get some objective testing done, I would recommend going to an ISAC professional, and they can look at your skin folds, not converting it into a body fat percentage, but just the raw skin folds, because that is actually quite accurate. And you can look at, I would say, probably no more frequently than every couple months with the same practitioner looking at your 8-site skin folds. And if your body mass is on average going up, which means you got to weigh like 3 times per week and take an average, while your skin folds are staying roughly the same or only slightly going up every couple months, that's a great sign for bulking, right? And then they can also, an ISAC professional can also do your measurements. And they can be like, yeah, you added, 2 centimeters to your arms in the last 6 months, but only 1 centimeter to your waist and hips. And you're like, oh, that's pretty good, That's not a realistic change for most advanced people, but that's the type of thing you'd want to do. I know people love DEXA. It's been told that it's the gold standard, but the margin of error on that for like body fat percentage is, depending upon the practitioner, no lower than 3% for an individual, and potentially as high as like 8 or 9%, which means if you go in there 2 days in a row, it can look like you gained or lost 5 kilograms of fat mass or lean mass. And then you have to think, well, okay, well, how frequently can I get a DEXA scan if I want to see a real change? And even if you're going like down to Grant Tinsley's lab and getting it done with that 3% error, you're probably talking about doing it no more than, say, 3 times a year at most, like every 4 months to know a real change. And you don't know how much of that change is real or within the margin of error. You just know if I exceeded the margin of error, some portion of it was real. So it's not a finely tuned enough measurement to really make a difference, to be useful. So potentially high quality skin fold thicknesses and circumferences, when you keep everything really precise and the same, like same time of day, same number of days since training, same type of training, same energy surplus, same hydration levels, same practitioner, and make sure the practitioner is an ISAC person. And if you're not doing that, then you want to take it similar lighting, same time of day, all that same stuff, but a video of you posing with like a matte background, not just random pictures, average body weight over time to make sure you're actually in a small surplus, and then ensuring that you're actually seeing training improvements objectively, able to add reps, able to add load a little bit over time on most movements. And that's about as good as it gets, unfortunately. If you've got access to an ultrasound, then yes, you can measure more minute changes more frequently, but most people don't.
But either way, I think you really put it in a elegant way. All this complexity, like I mentioned earlier, can become simple enough for most of us. Even if we don't have somebody with an ISAC certification, even if we just have the scale, we just have our training log, maybe that's enough. That's all that you really do need to ensure that you're gaining muscle when you look at the right things with this literature in mind and all its limitation and its context and so on and so forth. So my man, I don't want to take any more of your time. I think
No, don't worry
this
about it,
paper,
dude. Let me
this
say
paper,
one more thing about our paper, because
man, please.
another thing that we tend to do, which is a bit of a mistake when we look at papers, is we classify people as trained or untrained when there's a huge spectrum there. So the requirement to be in our study, like I mentioned the strength standards earlier, being able to squat at least 1.5 or 1.25 times your body weight as a man or woman, and then bench 1 or 0.75 times your body weight respectively. Having been training at least a year and also using the squat and bench press regularly at least once per week. That was our requirement to be in the study, and that's a good trained sample. But what that resulted in was that we had some people who just met that standard. They'd been training for, a couple of years, and they had a decent squat and bench, but maybe this was their first time like really pushing this hard, taking it seriously, and having some guidance on the movements and being pushed to failure, all that good stuff. But we had other people who had actually competed in shows and competed in powerlifting meets in the study as well. So we had legitimate advanced athletes, and then we had legitimate, what I would classify as late stage novices or early stage intermediates, who were absolutely trained, but they're not going to necessarily respond the same way. And even untrained people aren't going to respond the same way. Someone who just was really dealt a shit hand of genetics, or, let's say Phil Heath, if he never decided to lift weights and did my study, both are untrained, and they would both have very different responses to the program. So just remember that just because a study had a finding for trained people, it's not a statement about all trained people or you. It's just a little closer to the answer you want as a trained person compared to an untrained person. And I think we have to be able to have that level of nuance, because what we want to take from research is not the direct protocol and not go, all right, I'm going to run Helms' study and then eat at maintenance and I'll get just as good of gains, good to go. Or you know what, I'm going to run Helms' study protocol and just do 18 sets on everything and then go into small surplus and I'll see some good gains like they did in the biceps group. Now you have to take the concept and then you have to apply it to your unique situation and integrate it into what you're doing. And that's what actual evidence-based practice looks like, where you have not just research-informed decisions, but also individual differences in that final piece of evidence-based practice, which is your experiences.
And also then when we talk about study science, RCTs, we talk about results within a group. Maybe there are
Yes,
outliers, people that do one set and get Mr. Olympia level. Those people exist, man. I mean, it's gonna be super odd, but they do exist, and that's something that when we read science, or at least the abstract and the results, we tend to go that way. Oh, so bulking is not necessary, so bulking is a waste of time. For some people, it might kind of be, but there's still so much to apply from this study as a spectrum. You mentioned it perfectly, man. A spectrum. What about the training status? What about your current body composition? And also, the training status doesn't necessarily refer to how many years you have been in the gym.
that's
Maybe
right.
the rate of progress, like you mentioned in your books. So many things to take into account to ultimately get some simple recommendations. That's what I love the most about this thing, man, and about mass on itself. So anyway, my man, I think that does cover it. Anything else we can add to the discussion?
No, I think we did a great job, and you're always asked the best questions, and I really appreciate you giving me the platform to discuss. So I think that's mainly it. For everyone who's interested, if you want to read the study, we did our best to write it, especially in the discussion and the introduction, in very approachable language, and it is open access. So if you were to go to Sports Medicine Open, or if you just Google Helms small and large surpluses, and don't go to the preprint link at Research Square, go to Sports Medicine Open. You can read the full text. And if you want to even deeper dive, you can also check out Iron Culture, where I did a whole podcast episode on this, or just go to the beginning of this video and listen. So because I think we
Pretty
did a
much.
great job covering it. Yeah, for sure.
And also, I think it was a preprint, but I think it was Strexler that covered it in mass, right?
Actually,
As
yeah,
a
in
recent brief.
massresearchreview.com, Trexler wrote a great review of it, and I recused myself from peer review because obviously I have,
Yeah.
a bias for the study. And, the only thing I made sure to do is just made sure Trexler had the data that he needed, and he wrote about it in mass. So this kind of breakdown and this kind of nuance written about it, and also an audio summary, you can find for most of the studies that we think are relevant for people interested in, lifting weights. We're doing on a monthly basis at Mass Research Review. And by the way, we have Mass Research in Spanish.
En
So,
español, muchachos. I don't know if people here, I've seen some familiar faces. Let me go in Spanish. Para todos aquellos que quieran toda esta información disponible cada mes en español totalmente, no olviden suscribirse, pero voy a dejar el link más en español. In Spanish.
there you go.
My man, as always, I can never thank you enough for these kind of conversations. Myself, I think I'm the one that benefits the most because I learn a lot. I put my own ideas and beliefs into context, and with the main man, what more can I ask you, man? Honestly.
Well, dude, I tell you what, it's an honor and a privilege. And one thing anyone finds, and you know this because you're a teacher, you learn a ton from teaching because your brain understands it one way. But you get to expose yourself to new perspectives when you get asked questions and people see it through their lens of experience. And you learn so much by teaching, not just better ways to communicate it, but also sometimes you see where you were wrong or you missed something because people bring their own unique view to the table, and I benefit from that. So when you ask me questions, we both learn. So thank you.
It happens to me a lot that I get caught in my own bullshit, man. Like, oh, so maybe that wasn't right, right? That happens to
That's
me a
right.
lot, man.
100%.
So anyway, man, don't want to take any more of your time. For the millionth time, congratulations on that pro status. Man, it was such a bliss and such a privilege to watch. So Hope you have a great rest of the day. And as always, my man, more than open our doors in Mexico for you.
I can't wait to come back. You guys were the best hosts ever. So thank you so much, brother. Appreciate your time.
Have a great day, my man.